Queen Victoria had been inspired by Prince Albert's ideas, and in particular by his vision of Camelot, the fabled realm of King Arthur. According to legend, Arthur ruled over an empire whose greatness was judged not by the extent of its conquests, but by a belief that the strong should serve the weak, that good must triumph over evil, that might should be in the service of right. Albert hoped that these principles would be the guiding light for Victoria and for her people. But in the coming years, that dream would be shattered as the Queen, alone and more vulnerable, allowed the empire to take a very different path, a path which would lead her to the betrayal of Albert's ideals.
Victoria changed after Albert's death. In Albert's day, his feeling of civilizing the world meant bringing trade and education and progress and better standards of living to people. Victoria became less interested in that. Victoria wanted England to be dominant, to be preeminent. She thought it was the destiny of Britain to rule as much of the world as possible.
Victoria's empire had come about more by accident than by design. It was an empire based on trade, and to sustain it, the British had acquired naval bases, coaling stations, and colonies around the globe. By the middle of the 19th century, the British had become the richest and most powerful nation in the world. They had pioneered the age of steam. They made more than half the world's industrial goods, and 3/4 of the world's trade was carried in British ships. But despite this success, Victoria's cities were pits of poverty and deprivation.
There was never enough housing. The services were appalling, overcrowding, really very, very poor conditions. It was very easy for many just to lock themselves away and not to notice. Even in a great city like London, so many living in great houses could just shut their eyes to the huge disparities in wealth that industrialization was throwing up.
Nonetheless, Victoria's subjects, rich and poor, were united in the belief that God had chosen them for a special mission, to export not just the product of their industry, but their ideas of government, law, and morality.
Britain is a democracy, and the British people wish to know why their government is behaving in a certain way. If it is acquiring more territory, if it is fighting wars, then they like to know the reason. And the simple reason is a development of the older idea of Britain as the agent of civilization. Britain is bringing peace and order and stability to the world, to distant regions.
In the Victorian mind, nowhere was this civilizing mission more compelling or more dangerous than in Africa. In the mid-19th century, Africa was known as the Dark Continent, its vast interior largely unexplored by white men. It was believed by the Victorians to be a place of pagan worship, of blood sacrifice and tribal conflict. Inspired by Albert's vision of Camelot, men and women of the London Missionary Society journeyed here on a crusade to win converts to the Christian God, resolute in the belief that they were civilizing the continent. They included a man whose journeys into the heart of Africa would make him the most famous explorer of the Victorian age. His name was David Livingstone, a Scotsman. Born into a family of poor but passionate Christians, he worked in a cotton mill from the age of 10 and paid his own way through medical college.
As a boy, he was very interested in the world around him, and and there's stories about him looking for fossils in quarries and interested in the plants and so on. So he had an interest in this natural world, and science, of course, was developing at that time. I suppose that's why he sort of began to feel that he could do something through medicine to relieve suffering and so on. He had heard that you could be a medical missionary, and that's what he said, that's for me. And his father was a bit against this. He said, oh, doctors, they just look for their fees and so on. But he was fired with enthusiasm to take the gospel further. And working as a doctor and a missionary, he wasn't just going to deal with the spiritual side, he'd deal with the bodily side as well.
When Livingstone began his travels, the main British possession in Africa was a mere toehold on the southern tip of this vast continent. The port of Cape Town was a staging post on the long sea route to India. British governments had no interest in the interior, which was believed to be just thousands of miles of arid scrubland. But as Livingstone traveled northward to the continent's great central plateau, he discovered a different Africa. The scenery changed dramatically from desert to grassland, with tall trees and exotic wildlife. Livingstone wrote copious notes, documenting all the flora and fauna in minute detail. But it was a less pleasant encounter with the local wildlife that would first make him famous back in England. The doctor was working on an irrigation ditch when he was alerted that some lions were approaching the camp. He ran back to help his colleagues, but found himself the target of the lions' attack. He squeezed off one shot, but only grazed the beast. The wounded animal pounced. A native bearer saved his life. But Livingstone had been badly mauled and his arm was broken.
It was a terrible experience. And it wasn't just broken, but you see, it was crushed as well.
Miles from medical help, Livingstone treated his own wounds. He even managed to insert a screw into the broken bone.
I presume he was putting sticks as splints around and tying it, and what he couldn't do, he would have somebody saying, hold this and tie there and whatnot. Very painful, and of course very difficult to get a good setting in that way.
Weeks later, a fellow doctor inspected Livingstone's wound with astonishment.
He showed an amount of courage, sagacity, skill and endurance that have scarcely been surpassed in the annals of heroism.
Such stories, published by Livingstone and others, reached a wide audience in Europe and America. Readers were inspired not just with a sense of adventure, but with the feeling that they were joining the missionaries in an historic crusade.
The missionaries see themselves as the pathfinders of civilization. They are, like Livingstone, they can be explorers. The other value the missionaries have is that they are direct links between empire and the ordinary people. Everyone said prayers in church for their missions. Many churches and chapels supported their own missionary and regularly heard from him and sent money to him. And of course people liked to read about this, and it made them, if you like, feel good. I remember reading a marvellous one which said, think of these unhappy pagans and how much your money can help to bring them to Christ, to redemption, etc., etc.
Despite his growing fame, Livingstone had little success in Christianizing the Africans. His only recorded conversion was the baptism of a chief called Disraeli.
The trouble was, Chief Disraeli had several wives, but he had to have only one wife if he was going to join the church. But he was a very sincere man. He put his other wives away, gave them presents and said, sorry, I'm taking this new religion. He became a Christian. And that, has been said, was Livingstone's only convert. And then it's said, but he fell by the wayside because within a short time he took one of his wives back.
When the chief lapsed, Livingstone was devastated, but he continued his quest to bring medicine and Christianity to Africa. He endured terrible hardships, heat, rain and mud, the constant fear of attack from animals or hostile tribes, of desertion by his own men, and of disease. During the first 3 years of his travels, Livingstone suffered 27 bouts of fever. He struggled across rivers and through tropical forests with a racing heart, agonizing headaches, dizziness and diarrhea. He was driven by his Christian ideals and a nearly messianic self-belief.
See, O Lord, how the heathen rise up against me as they did to thy Son. Should such a man as I flee? Nay, verily.
After 15 years of exploration, Livingstone made his most spectacular discovery.
They came down this great broad river which spreads out to, more than a mile wide there. And they came down and there's an island ahead and the water was flowing on either side, and he said that we're gonna make this or we're gonna be swept to one side or the other. Then you land on the island, as he did, and looked over and you saw this huge fall, the largest curtain of water in the world. He felt this was a wonder of nature, a wonder of God's creation. He said angels in their flight must have seen sights like this.
Livingstone named the site in honor of his queen, the Victoria Falls. Livingstone continued northwards and came across a spectacle that was to change his entire mission. He was horrified to see chain gangs being driven to the coast bound for the slave markets of Arabia.
The sights I have seen, though common incidents of the traffic, are so nauseous that I always strive to drive them from memory. But the slaving scenes come back unbidden and make me start up at dead of night, horrified by their vividness.
Slavery had been banned throughout the British Empire in 1833, and the Royal Navy tried to intercept illegal slave runners bound for America. But the slave trade continued unchallenged in East Africa. Livingstone was determined that Britain must rid the continent of what he called the open sore of the world. He concluded that the slavers must be tempted into more acceptable ways of making a living, that Africa must be civilized not by force, but by trade.
My desire is to open a path into Africa, that civilization, commerce, and Christianity might find their way there.
He would devote himself to exploration and attempt to find a route for British trade into the interior. Where commerce led, the cross would surely follow, and with it, he hoped, freedom and justice for the enslaved people of Africa.